Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by BCS America.
BCS two-wheel tractors are often mistaken for just another rototiller, but these compact power units are truly superior pieces of farming equipment. Engineered and built in Italy, where small farms are a way of life, BCS tractors are built to standards of quality and durability expected by professional growers. Available for a fraction of the cost of four-wheel tractors, BCS will perform a lot of jobs more safely and efficiently than their four-wheel cousins. Jobs like shredding cover crops, spreading compost, and preparing seed beds in covered hoop houses without compacting soil, mowing on steep slopes with your feet safely on the ground, cutting grass and brush under fence lines and low trees, clearing snow on footpaths, and more. Don't just take our word for it. Join more than 2 million people in over 80 countries who have discovered the advantages of owning Europe's most popular two-wheel tractor. To learn more and find your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com.
Today's show is also brought to you by Growers & Co. One of the most exciting developments in recent years is that, thanks to Jean-Martin Fortier, the market gardener, and his team, there is now a clothing, tool, and apparel company that was built for exactly the type of work we talk about on this show. I know that I've personally grown tired of looking through workwear websites and catalogs built for fishing or carpentry to find what I need for market gardening, so I was thrilled when Growers & Co. came to fruition, and even more thrilled when I tried their clothing. They have done absolutely excellent work. Their clothing is well made and well fitted. The tools are well designed by growers and made to last. There is also a magazine that Growers & Co. is putting out twice per year with a focus on small scale farming. I love the clothes. I rock the Muscovich vest a lot. The shirts, the hats, all of it. Anyway, follow Growers & Co. on Instagram and all the platforms and check out what they have to offer at growers.co. All right, let's jam. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 27. Season 3 got a really great episode for you all this week with Andrew Manns of Manns Organics in Alberta, Canada. And I was really excited to talk to Andrew because Manns Organics is a fascinating operation. First, it is not small. They farm 100 acres of vegetables with a 1 acre greenhouse. It is that greenhouse that we focus on a lot for this conversation, but less about the structure and more about all of the interesting ways in which Andrew manages the crops, from taking Sap Analyses every few weeks to intercropping to amendment applications and all of it. We also talk about field production and watering off of a center pivot. He does not consider himself a no-tiller, but is very dedicated to soil and crop health and has started experimenting with not tilling in the tunnel. As a small grower, I find so much great info from conversations like this. I love getting that large scale perspective, and I know you will too. But first, if you have not had a chance to pre-order a copy of my forthcoming book, The Living Soil Handbook, which ships in July of 2021, you can do that now at no-tillgrowers.com. You can also get it anywhere books are sold, but if you buy it from no-tillgrowers.com, the proceeds go to making more content. As I've said elsewhere, I get a small royalty from the publisher or whatever, but the sales at no-tillgrowers.com go into bringing you more videos, more podcasts, more educational stuff that we can give away for anyone, anywhere to watch. Our entire business model is how can we make a reasonable living giving away content? And sometimes it involves a fundraiser like hats, or in this case, a book. Anyway, check that out at no-tillgrowers.com. And don't forget that I'm shouting out everyone who signs up for the Patreon page in April. So you can do that at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers. Oh, and the discounts there apply to the book. So there you go. All right, enough from me. I have got a great conversation to share with you from Andrew Manns of Manns Organics. Andrew Manns, welcome to the podcast.
Good. Great to hear from you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to have you on. Okay, so we'll start kind of where we always start with this podcast. Could you tell us a little bit about the farm? Where are you located, how much land you're working on, and those sorts of things?
Sure. We are in southern Alberta. We are about an hour and a half north of the border with Montana. We are in an area that, it's cold. It's Canada, but we still get a lot of sunlight. We farm 100 acres of total cropland, and the main or big part of our farm is our greenhouse, which is a fully heated, full year greenhouse, and it is covering 1 acre, so 45,000 square feet, with about 38,000 square feet of active production, and the rest of the area being, utility, propagation, concrete walkways, etc. In the greenhouse, we grow tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, some eggplant, and now some ginger and turmeric. And the field crops, we are focusing on garlic, onions, shallots, winter squash, and cantaloupe and watermelons in our summer season. And then the, so to speak, rest of the area, we do some spring wheat or some cover crops and kind of use that as the soil health aspect, and growing animal feed for a few of the animals we grow here, and kind of work our way that way. But we grow kind of the more of the storage type field crops and keep employees all year. And then the greenhouse, of course, is busier in production, which is kind of mid-March to mid-December. And that keeps us hopping.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm excited to dive into this greenhouse a little bit. I did not realize it was a full acre. That's really amazing. Okay, so what about marketing? Like, where's all the produce going?
Yes, so Alberta is a province of about 4.5 million people, and the large bulk of our produce goes into the two main cities, Calgary and Edmonton. We consider those local, even though we're talking 2 and 5 hours distance. But we work with mostly kind of smaller, independent, natural foods, organic grocery stores, some restaurants. So we work with a local distributor who brings together produce from a number of growers like us in our area and delivers to restaurants and other places. And so we don't really deal with the big guys, but I should point out that we are exclusively wholesale. We don't do any farmers markets ourselves. We work with a few people at farmers markets, other producers, but we don't do any retailing ourselves. We don't really sell at the farm. We do sell some, second grade to family and friends, but we're really focused on the wholesale part of the selling all of our product.
And you said you're certified organic, right?
Yes, correct. We are in the greenhouse as well as field crops. Everything we do. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's great. So, all right, I want to talk about, I know that we're going to want to spend a lot of time on a few different things that you're working on. So let's get into the greenhouse stuff. And feel free to get as detailed on this as you want. I want to talk, let's just maybe kind of break down some of this infrastructure a little bit, and a little bit about how it's designed. You said it's heated year round. Maybe talk about what you're heating it with, in any, sort of important or relevant details about how the actual greenhouse is set up.
Sure. So our main structure is a 28,000 square foot gutter connect greenhouse. It's nothing in terms of greenhouses, nothing unusual. It's a fairly typical 21-foot bay, double plastic, double poly with inflation. It's heated with boiler and hot water. So we have steel pipes on the ground and hanging above the crops, which circulate hot water. That greenhouse is heated throughout the year. We cannot let it freeze. We're going in there, starting new crops in December, getting them out in the soil there in, from January to beginning of February, and typically running those up into early December. So we also have two 30-foot wide by 276-foot long houses, which is a high tunnel. They are fully heated, but we can turn those off for the coldest month or two of the year. They're heated with forced air and 12-inch poly tubes with pre-punched holes that go, two of them down along the ground and one up in the higher area in the truss that holds the crop. So yeah, those are heated with 4 heaters, and like I said, they can go off in the winter. The disadvantage with those is that lot less efficiency with the heaters as well. Our main gutter connect has an energy curtain, which when it's colder than, we've set it at approximately 4 degrees. When it's colder than that, the energy curtain closes overnight and traps about, I think they call it about 60% of the heat that goes out the top. It helps retain that. So there's quite a bit of a energy efficiency gain on our gutter connect greenhouse, with the boiler being more efficient and the energy curtain being used.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so talk about, are you doing permanent beds in there? Like, what's the sort of bed setup?
Sure. Yes, it is permanent. The heating pipe, the pipe rails we talked about, they also have a double function as rails for our electric scissor carts, which lift us up and down for crop work, and our harvest carts, which we push up and down these rails. And they are on a 5'4" spacing. So we have 4 rows of crop per 21-foot bay. So these beds are, yes, they've been there for, this is season number 9 we're starting, and they've been there since day 1. So yes, we're working in a very permanent bed system there, and keep growing crops in the same places with drip line irrigation.
All right, so maybe take us through, I want to focus a little bit more on tunnel production in terms of like a specific crop or two. So maybe you can take us through, because you do interesting things like a lot of interplanting, and it looks like there's some mulches in your paths and different things. And I'm curious, can you take us through a crop? Let's just maybe say something like cucumbers, and kind of start to finish on that in the greenhouse, and you can include interplants and that sort of stuff too. And I'd be curious to hear that whole sort of arc.
Sure. So yes, cucumbers is one of our main crops. It's a less of a square footage, like less of a scale in terms of the percentage of the area, because they do yield fairly well and just with market. So cucumbers are actually pretty quick crop in the greenhouse. In the full year greenhouse growing world, the hydroponic world, it is very typical to do, multiple crops, 3, even 4, even 5 crops of mini cucumbers and 2 or 3 of long English. We focus on 2 crops per year of cucumbers. So we do a spring crop, which starts, we actually put that one in the ground last in about February 10th. Those are in production already, and they will produce approximately until July. And in July, we will do a couple of staggered plantings where we actually are replacing that same crop with new plants. And that new crop will then take us into the end of the year, into late November, early December. The mini cucumbers last year, that spring crop, we hang all these cucumbers. We do grow them high wire. So we're actually using a pre-wound hook similar to the tomatoes. And last spring, our spring mini cucumber crop, we actually ran out of crop string before the end of the season. So we had 44 feet of vine growth before July.
Wow.
So I think we averaged from February to July, we averaged 3.5 inches of plant growth per day as an average from the beginning of the season till July. So lots of growth, lots of speed. Interplanting, we do 2 things. We grow our ginger now with peppers, but on the tomatoes and cucumbers, we don't interplant a production crop. We will plant some various, if you want to call it a cover crop / beneficial plant, flowers. One thing we've learned the last year or 2, we've actually eased off on how many plants we put with tomatoes and cucumbers, just because those crops jump up quick and really shade out. They just cannot be over so quick. And the crop that you've put, next door or below just doesn't do much anymore. So we've actually kind of eased off on the beneficial plants and flowers underneath cucumbers and tomatoes. We will let things grow. I mean, there's in our greenhouse, the way we term it is the only weed really is a volunteer tomato plant. Everything else, if it's not really affecting our work and the plants, we just let it go. If it's volunteer flowers or if it's quote unquote a weed, if it's not harming us, then is it really in the wrong place at the wrong time? So we kind of look at that aspect of letting things go. Sometimes it, depends what your perspective is. It can look a little wild, but, is that just natural or how do we, what's our perspective on that is, good or bad. So I kind of look at it from that way. It's not to say that every plant we've put in there, we know, if it's right or exactly what it does. I just firmly believe in biodiversity and, more plant roots in the ground, more plants above the ground. It's good for insects. It's good for the biology below the ground. It's good for soil health. And that kind of leads me into the thought of rotation. We have crops like tomatoes. We grow more than probably about half of our space. So that means that every year, half of our area is tomatoes. So our rotation isn't really rotation. It's, tomatoes and peppers and tomatoes and peppers, or tomatoes and cucumbers and tomatoes and cucumbers from year to year. So when you look at the diversity of plants and the roots below the ground and what you're, feeding the biology and how you're treating the biology and caring for your soil, I think is important to not having issues or not relying on rotation. Rotation is less of an issue for me when things are healthy and in rhythm.
Right. Okay. So in terms of nutritional management, then in terms of fertility management, what's that look like, and how are you sort of determining that?
Yeah. That's a really big question here because I'm very, very intense on that. Well, for start, for example, soil amendments, nutrition on the soil is varied. I do soil testing at the end of the year. I am a lot less reliant or concerned about soil testing than I used to be. I don't feel that we need to take a soil test and be, so concerned and make it all right. I think the plant is a much better, more accurate indicator of what we need to do to the soil, right? If the plant is getting something, we'll probably have enough. If it, the soil test may say we have something, the plant doesn't get it, or vice versa. Let's ask the plant what it needs. So this year we actually did not till our beds at all. In past years, if we're adding a soil amendment such as gypsum or potassium, like we've used sunflower hull ash as a potassium source for the soil. So then we've had the need to till that into the top layers of the soil, right? Just to put the amendment to mix it up. This past year, we actually did not do any amendments to our soil, and we did not till, and we left everything there. We didn't even, necessarily clean up all of the plant residue, and we just came back in and we put a little cover crop in, some buckwheat, peas, and oats ahead of our transplants. We gave it some moisture, and then we came in with our plants, and off we went. So that's the kind of the soil part of it. Now we do a lot of sap analysis where we send plants leaves to Nova Crop Control, a plant lab in Holland, and they do the sap testing, and we do that every 3 weeks through the season. So I get about I do that for about approximately a 40-week period where we're sending every 3 weeks, and I do a lot of nutrition via either injection in a drip line and a lot of foliar nutrition with the sap analysis results. So really keeping that crop kind of on a very accurate fine-tuning type of nutrition strategy that way. On the compost end of things, we actually only ever used compost, chicken manure-based compost the very first season before we started, and I've not used significant compost other than vermicompost from a local producer here. But in that aspect, I've not used compost since the first year.
Interesting. Are you doing other things for biological amending then?
Not like we do. We'll do something like alfalfa pellets on the soil, just a bit. Other amendments have been, I'm going to say in the past, more of the kind of like azomite, the rock powders, those types of things, micronized soft rock. But we've kind of also gone easier on those in the last years. I think we've kind of, the first years you're intensively building, and then as you get to a better place with your soil, you start to ease off or slow down. One of the big ingredients into this big greenhouse strong long season is we use quite a bit of fish hydrolysis, and that's a good one to really fires up biology and keeps things going. And that's kind of a very steady injection throughout the growing season. We keep putting that in.
And you're doing that, that's going through the fertigation?
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. And so what about compost teas and that sort of stuff? None of that sort of biological amending. You're more feeding the biology than necessarily adding the biology.
Correct. We have done teas and extracts in the past. It hasn't been now, I think it's been 2 years. I haven't done any of that in the greenhouse. Just the soil there is very much alive. I mean, it's going all year. There's a ton of biology. There's a lot of worms. So we've very much gone, away from the point of trying to, put either bugs in a jug, as I term it, on, or a compost tea, and going to the, feed what's there. And another note on that is, last year we started it is we, instead of taking our prunings, for example, I mentioned these cucumbers are growing 3.5 inches a day. We're pruning approximately 6 leaves per week from the bottom of these plants. And in prior years, we would put this in a compost bin and take it outside and put it on our compost pile. But last year we started to put these on the soil, and it's kind of that, mulching in place. And it's also the plant where we've been working on that nutrition to get it, right. We've been building this plant. So now we're taking that same plant, putting it on the soil, letting the soil biology decompose it in place and put it back into the plant. So that's been quite successful, and we're expanding it to the rest of the crops this year. But once the soil biology takes a couple of weeks to kind of learn, to realize what you're doing. The first few leaves, it kind of takes some time, but once the biology has adapted or it knows you're feeding it this leaves, it really, it keeps right up, no problem at all. It's just these leaves just keep disappearing, and we're just dropping them on the top of the soil.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm assuming that you're not seeing as much disease pressure.
Yeah.
To be doing that, you're less likely to put a leaf on the ground than if it's got disease pressure. So,
yes and no.
Okay.
For example, last year was a really good year. We didn't see mildew in the cucumbers really at all. But that being said, I'm quite a firm believer in a healthy plant does not, really succumb to disease. And I'm not saying that we're there all the time. Absolutely not. I'm still learning. I'm still learning every day. But I really believe that that's true, and I've seen it. And that's the main goal here is I don't so much worry about, having to get rid of every disease or clean up, every bit of soil or eradicate every insect. Everything has its place. It's just as long as the beneficials, the strength of the plant, or the, amount of beneficial insects or biology is better and in the right environment, then the problems are not issues. So even if we have some mildew on cucumber leaves, I'm still not concerned about putting that on the soil. I think once, the mildew is there anyways. I don't think with the amount of other plants we have growing, or, we get plants growing along the sidewalls and all of that, we're not going to ever get to a position where, every speck of mildew in this greenhouse is eradicated, and that's not our intent. So I think it's still just focus on that plant health, ask the plant what it needs via sap test, via just, even understanding the plant after growing them for that many years and working with that plant health. And of course, there's things like the climate, right? Watching the, humidity or trying not to have, drip on plants where the plants are wet all the time and things like that. So there is obviously, other considerations, but really focusing on that plant health. A healthy plant is not really a magnet for disease or insects. And that's, the primary goal.
That's great. Just to stick with the nutritional element for a minute, you mentioned the fish hydrolysate, you mentioned alfalfa pellets and that sort of stuff. When that Sap analysis comes back, what kind of recommendations are you seeing? Are you seeing, generally things that are more in the nitrogen category, or are you seeing a lot of, like, what's the kind of recommendations that they're making?
Sure. Two things to add on to what a sap analysis is. It is actually a new leaf and an old leaf sample. So when I start the year with sending my first samples out, I pick a variety or a row of tomatoes, and I pick a row of peppers and cucumbers, etc. And I will test the same row throughout the year. And what you do is you take a set of leaves from what's called the newest fully developed leaf and a set of leaves from the oldest functional leaf. And you send those in a separate bag, and they actually analyze both of them. And your results come in kind of a bar chart with the old and new leaf next to each other. So that's one of the nice parts about sap analysis. It gives you more information just from a one-time snapshot. Like, we know that potassium is highly mobile in the plant. So if the new leaf shows enough potassium, but the old leaf is already showing it's low, well, we might not visibly see a deficiency in the top of the plant, but because we know the old leaves are dropping, we can address these problems earlier or before they become problems. So that's a really nice, I think, a strong feature of the SAP analysis. They don't actually come with, or I don't get them with recommendations. I do that, so to speak, myself. The other thing is, as you go and you keep your data from the last 3 weeks, you can, just look and see I'm going to call it the trends, right? If a certain nutrient has been falling or you're addressing it, but it's not coming up fast enough. 3 weeks is a fairly quick cycle. It seems to be the happy medium. More often just gets more costly, obviously, and farther apart seems too long. That seems to be 3 weeks seems to be the happy medium for us. But I look at them. For example, we send them off on Monday morning. Friday morning early, I get the results emailed. And typically that day, we're doing the foliars and the injection to, so to speak, make the corrections or adjustments. So I look at it, and, every crop is different. Kind of to touch on your question there on, is it nitrogen? It can be. Nitrogen is actually typically not my biggest concern. It's, I think with all of the biology and everything pumping away, it has become a lot, less of a concern / issue. What we'll see is, for example, large tomatoes as the season goes on, keeping potassium up has been probably one of our biggest challenges. Is just they use so much of it. And even though we've got a lot of biology active, it's just they're, intensely feeding. Makes me think of something I wanted to bring up too, is we're talking really large yields here. I did the math on it. Our peak yields on our big tomatoes on, Roma's tomatoes in the vine or beefsteak. We talk about it in kilos per square meter, but if we convert it, we're doing in the tune of about 520,000 pounds per acre. So we're over 500,000 pounds per acre of yield per year. So the nutrition demand is, of course, very high.
Wow. Yeah. And then all the nutritional elements, you're doing that all also through the fertigation, right? Like, you're not doing any foliar sprays for the nutritional part of it?
Yes, we are. Yes.
Oh,
so
okay.
our foliar sprays are very much focused on nutrition. So it's a combination. Some nutrients are more, through the soil, but then some are very mobile. Potassium jumps to mind there again, is a big one for high mobility. Another one there on the micros is manganese. We do have fairly high pH soil, and, manganese is just something that really across the board on all of our crops in the greenhouse, we're always, struggling with manganese. So that's one that we typically keep foliar spraying as well. So foliar spraying isn't about like bulk nutrient application, right? It's about like the little nudges to steer that crop, right? Or it's sometimes if you've gotten yourself into, your problem is a little worse than it should be, it can be an extra tool, right? You can fertigate, but things take some time, while the foliar is kind of like you get out and you put it on that leaf and it's sucked into the leaf, and boom, you've kind of made the first, part to steering your crop the right way instantly. So it's kind of, but it's not the it's not the focus of the main volume or the main, amounts of nutrition.
What kind of tool are you using for the application of those foliars? Is it just a backpack sprayer, or what's the setup there?
Yeah. We've basically just built our own sprayer. It's nothing fancy, complicated. It's so we have the carts where the pipe rails where the carts drive on in the greenhouse. So we've just built one of those, and we've modified it with it carries a 45-gallon drum, and we've got a vertical spray boom with nozzles pointing both directions, and we can make it taller or shorter, and we just literally drive to the back of the row and then turn the sprayer on and drive down the row. So it's you just sit on it and you ride along, and it's just a couple of 12-volt diaphragm pumps and your typical spray nozzles and a tank. So a little bit of a home built creation there.
Yeah, that's great. And then you're mulching the pathways, or is that just depending on the crop, or how does that? Are you doing other mulches? Are you doing mulches on the beds? What's the story there?
Mm-hmm. So a couple of years ago, I think 3 years ago, we had we managed to snag a bunch of wood chips. We're not in wood chip country. We're kind of in the middle of the prairies here, but we had some wood chips, and that year we mulched the beds a bit and we mulched the paths. Previously, we had put ground cover with the white side up on the paths, which works, but it gets dirty and it folds up and things like that, and we get soil on top of it. And we would every year try to clean it up. But we went to wood chips there, and those have lasted already for 3 years. The other thing to note is this is in the greenhouse, so these paths typically stay dry all of the time. We're irrigating with drip line in between. So those wood chips, they've lasted for a couple of years, and now I'm thinking we might have to give them a little top up in a year or two. But that's the in between the pipe rails is where your feet are all of the time when you're walking up and down harvesting and doing the crop work from the ground.
Yeah, that's great. I want to hear more about this pepper ginger interplant. What's the scoop there?
Sure. So the ginger is a newer to us crop. It's actually, I believe came from one of Curtis Stone's little videos here. So I told Curtis the other day, I said, thanks to you, this ginger is a thing now. So he, I think I can't even remember where, put on one of his little YouTube clips. And so I thought, hey, I'm going to try that. And so in 2019, we did kind of a bit of a smaller scale trial yet. We planted, I think, a couple of 100 pounds. So, and we thought, well, we'll put it next to the peppers. So the reasoning there is that the peppers, the ones you saw in the picture there, those were actually planted January 7th. So we're almost 3 months in, and they're still, 4 feet tall only, right? So there's a lot of light to be, left over, if you want to call it that. And that's where the ginger fits in for the light aspect. The pepper crop takes quite a few months, and even if that crop is 6 or 7 or 8 feet tall, there's still some light coming down to the bottom. So that works well. And I don't know if there's other reasons. We just tried that and kind of adapted irrigation a little bit for the peppers, and nutrition wise, we haven't really worked on or worried about the ginger at this point. We've just kept our focus on the peppers. But last year we did a full out ginger interplanting with the peppers again, and this year as well. And yes, it's definitely working. The one thing we kind of have is you do have this, fairly large ginger crop next to the peppers, and it can get a little bit in the way of the pepper pruning and harvest at the beginning. Later on, once your peppers are higher, like once we're harvesting peppers at 3 or 4 feet or up on carts, it's not an issue anymore. And the only other challenge really is that if the ginger leans or falls over, then we start to run it over with the carts. So we may have to just with some pins and pull a string or something this year, just do something for it to lean on so it doesn't get in the way and trampled on as much. But for the rest, it's kind of a good fit. And not that we did anything specific really for that either. We just run it, the climate for the peppers, really focus on that whole zone still for pepper production. And then the ginger is kind of like, the bonus.
Right. And then are you pulling that ginger I'm assuming you're pulling the ginger before the peppers have been terminated, right? Or have senesced?
Correct. So we're just once the ginger is big enough to start. I think last year we started in July, which was a bit early, but once the ginger is the first ones are ready for big enough for market, then we just start harvesting as to order. So we just start on the first rows of ginger that were planted, and as we get the orders in per week, we just harvest what we need and sell it, and then we just work our way across this zone. And last year, I think we did have to harvest a little bit of ginger in December when the peppers were ready to come out, but for the rest, we've been harvesting for a couple of months, and that worked out well.
Hey, you all, just jumping in real quick to get a word from our sponsors like Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil makes NOP-compliant living potting soils in Cleveland, Ohio. With food scraps they haul and compost themselves. Each batch of soil is tested against the competitors and the results are in. Plants vote for Tilth Soil. To learn more about their full line of products, please visit www.tilthsoil.com. This show is also brought to you by you, the patrons. Did you know that we have nearly 600 patrons at patreon.com/no-till-growers? Like I said at the top of the show, I will be shouting out everyone who signs up in the month of April 2021. And as always, anyone who bumps up from one level to another. So this week, big shout outs to Mike Mustard, Adrian and Julia Newman, Restoration Fields Farm, John, Ojai Roots, Rimmel Greenhouse Systems, Scott Snodgrass, Jody Miller, Shane and Emma of Aslan Organics, Travis and Heidi of Arcadia Acres, Jacob Arthur, Fiona and Donnie of Firefly Farm, Jean-Martin Fortier, and Yannick Laplante. Big thanks to all of our show supporters. All right, back to Andrew. That's all great. I want to go outside now. I want to talk a little bit about field management, because when you're in a greenhouse, you can kind of dial it in and get really, really concentrated on your sort of fertility management. What does that look like outside? Can you kind of talk a little bit more about your fields, and the fertility management out there?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess first thing to note in field crops is that we are not no permanent bed system. We have overhead irrigation with center pivot. So we use that. We will actually use drip and plastic mulch on squash and melons with that system. But for onions and garlic, we are under pivot irrigation, and we are rotating that. We're, taking pies out of our circle every year. And so there's no permanent beds, right? We're in a different place, a different orientation, every year, different volume, or size of field. That we run on kind of, you can still maybe call it a row crop system. Our tractor is actually on 7-foot centers. And so we've got basically large, like 100 horsepower tractors for that. Even though we're typically on those crops, we're still managing the crop in between the tires. So we're still really managing, one bed at a time, if you want to call it that. And for onions and garlic, we're planting 3 rows of crop per bed. When it comes to kind of the fertility and the soil management, we have used more compost in the past year, some cattle manure, chicken manures. We've blended chicken manure with wood chips for composting and applied that. I'm getting to a point where there's, less compost needed, just in terms of fertility is quite good. It's quite decent. It's quite balanced. So I don't want to, definitely not going to keep putting on compost, especially when it's manure-based compost, which we're in, animal country. So there's an abundance of manure here, but we don't want to keep doing keep pushing up the potassium and phosphate levels, right, to, way up there and running into other troubles. So that's kind of on that end. And we also do cover crops, quite intensively. So for the full year ahead of onions and garlic, we'll run a multi-species, 20, 24 species cover crop. We'll typically seed that in mid-May and terminate that with a rototiller here about second, third week of July. You have about 18 to 24 inches of crop growth. We come by at a fairly good rate of speed with a rototiller and not real deep, just chop that crop up, mix it in the top layer of soil, leave it for just a couple of days to make sure it's dead, and then actually give it some water. And the water fires up the biology and gets the worms back up. And in 2-3 weeks from that time, that crop is literally gone. It's been digested. And then we come in and we seed cover crop again. And that cover crop is a little less diverse, and it's all species that will be terminated by our winters. So that way, when we come in the spring for onions, for example, we don't have to worry about cover crop that's going to jump back to life. So that's kind of the overview of cover crops. Now, I think cover crops is not necessarily a nutrition aspect of it for us, but more of a soil builder, soil structure, ground cover. Obviously, erosion is a big concern here. We're in southern Alberta where 100 kilometers an hour wind from the west for an entire day is normal. When the wind is beating like that for, relentlessly, you've got to keep things down. So that's where cover crops come in as well. But so not necessarily entirely for nutrition on cover crops, not necessarily considered, a green manure, but more the, diversity of roots in the soil, right? Feeding that biology in the soil and going from there. On other nutrition in the fields, we are more and more going to the Sap analysis as well. We will do foliar nutrition. And another thing I should add on to that is we can also do things like micronized gypsum or even vermicompost. We've built an extractor / injector. We can put a 300-gallon tank by this center of this pivot for the irrigation, and we can spend a day and we can actually put vermicompost directly through the irrigation without, straining. The whole works can go through, and we can put, things like humic acid or different rock products like azomite again, or some boron in the form of soluble or something like that. So we can go and kind of get these nutrients out over the acres very, very evenly through the water.
That's great. Yeah. And maybe just in case anybody doesn't know, the center pivot irrigation is, that's very common out west. It's just a large,
correct.
Circular. It goes like, can you, maybe you can describe it a little better than I imagine it. I grew up in Colorado. So when you would fly out of the, airport, you'd look down and there's basically like circles of water down below you.
Circles of green.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm curious, with that center pivot irrigation setup, what happens to those corners? Like, do you do anything
Sure.
to maximize that space?
Yeah. Good question. So what we do in the corners is not farm them with veggies or intensively with the pivot. So we have, I guess on our farm is a little unique because we're not a typical square farm. So my parents have a house on the farm here as well. So they're in one, and one of them we just leave in grass, and they're relative to the size of the farm. They're not big, right? If you have we have 3.5 acres on the corner. We're quite arid here. We're quite dry. So without the irrigation, your options for what you grow are very much more limited. And given our organic growing methods on dry land, it's a few of these areas we don't want to till if we don't have irrigation, so we just don't. But then we also just don't farm them with veggies or farm them actively. So we'll just leave them grass, leave them for native animals, birds, especially the birds really like that. But then we have one closer to the greenhouse, which we'll just use drip irrigation on with plastic mulch some years. And we have another one where family of mine is actually working on a little, berry patch. So we're kind of just using those areas for other things and not actively farming them. And to add on, the center pivot is we actually have small ones. They're shorter. They have you've got your center point, and then you've got your towers, which are your pipe and your braced arch, and then sets of wheels. And they just drive in a circle while they water. Now, of course, it takes some time. I mean, I think we put 600 gallons a minute through a pivot, and it takes, I can't remember, about 30 hours if you want to put an inch of water on in a full circle. So
okay, yeah, that's great. I've always been curious about how those work and like what kind of things you can do to manage those corners. Yeah, that's great. That's great info. Okay, so I've got a couple questions from some of our Patreon members, because we always, we let our Patreon members ask questions of the guests, and I have a few that are kind of that I think are kind of in line with some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. One is from Pam McNary, who asks about Brix levels. Are you measuring Brix levels, and then do you know like what kind of Brix levels you're getting in the tunnels?
Yes. So good question. Yes. So my answer to that is yes, I do check. It's for me, it's an indication when things are right, and your Brix will show that. But Brix in and of itself isn't really a tool to use. It's an indication, or it will show you what's happening. But if you have a low Brix reading, for example, and you've taken that off of whatever plant, if it's a cucumber, it still doesn't give you a piece of usable information. You just know the Brix is low, but that's, you could be short in any nutrient or high into something else, or you could have not enough oxygen in the soil, right? You're not getting root growth. You're for whatever vast number of reasons, you could have low Brix, but seeing your low Brix doesn't give you anything to work with. And that's not that there's something wrong with reading Brix. It's just, it's not enough information, which is where, for example, the Sap analysis comes in. When you get the Sap analysis, it lists all of the nutrients, it lists the sugars, the EC. You now have the tool which, shows you the nutrients that are high or low, or what's happening, and actually gives you something to work with to address the problem. Now, kind of on that note is, for example, last year again, we had really good crop. We had quite, not much for disease or insect pressure, good yield, just everything kind of really, really ticked along well last year. And the Brix levels were quite consistently and quite generally on the high side. So it's agreeing with what we're seeing. We're typically seeing, we had pretty good balances of micronutrients, like the, plant level Sap analysis, things were in balance, things were kind of, between the ditches and, in the right direction. And the Brix is kind of saying, agreeing and saying, yes, okay, we're getting, 14s on peppers, 12, 13, 14 on grape tomatoes, cucumbers. I'm never seeing that kind of levels. We're seeing, 8s, 7s and 8s as a okay level on cucumbers. If my Brix is, 3 on cucumbers, we're in trouble. But even though I know I'm in trouble, it doesn't give me anything else to work with. So that's kind of the catch with just regarding Brix. It's yes, it's a tool, but it doesn't really give you much to work with. So it's not enough, I don't think, to manage your crop.
Right. Yeah. There's not enough information there. I think it's a really interesting way of, if you're consistent about it, you can see some trends and you can see if the things that you're doing are helping. But okay. So, sort of in that line, Yvonne Thompson asks about pest management in the greenhouse. I'm thinking about pests being less likely to consume plants that are higher in Brix. So there's my segue there. But generally, like, what's your sort of pest management, and do you have big pest issues in the greenhouses?
Yeah, for sure. So yes, pests are a concern, are an issue, or are an issue if you're not real careful. That's for sure. So yes, we're intensively managing, and the biggest thing there is literally we are weekly buying biological, so buying beneficial insects of various types, and pretty much weekly releasing that in the greenhouse to manage these. Now there's quite a few systems, so I can kind of touch on a few. Our probably number one concern is aphids on peppers. Number two concern is probably thrips and spider mites and or on cucumbers. And number three would be potential whitefly in tomatoes. Now there's a few other things, but those are kind of the three in the order I would classify them as. And aphids in peppers is very much we use a blend of the parasitic wasp, and then you've got the little midge, the Aphidoleides. So that's the parasitic wasps, they fly up to the aphid and lay an egg in the aphid, which in turn, it grows inside the aphid, turns the aphid into a mummy, and then hatches out sometime later and goes on to repeat the process. So that's a big tool. Very much with all the biologicals is timing. Nothing happens, at the snap of a finger. So we're ordering on a Wednesday for delivery the next Tuesday or Wednesday. And if they come as a mummy or some of these bugs still have to, complete their life cycle. So there's another, time frame there. And then, so it's more about being preventative than it is about reacting. If you're in the reaction, part of it, you're late and it's going to hurt more. And I would say, looking back to my experience, now I walk through the crops and kind of, really just a gut feeling. I know how much of which one I should order for next week, right? And where to release it and all of that good stuff. But in the earlier years, I always said that was the biggest challenge, or the most, detailed piece of science involved with greenhouse growing was the bugs, the entomology. There's just so much, different kinds of aphids and, different times of year and different climate, humidity, different insects work different ways, all of that good stuff. To kind of add to that is we do use a couple of other systems. And for example, in the peppers yet, there's a beneficial bug mite called degenerans, and it will actually establish on the crop and live off of the pollen in the flowers. And once you've established that on the crop, you are literally, immune to thrips and to spider mites on a pepper crop. Like there's no way they're coming, because these good guys have built up an army on these plants. So some insects, you apply at the beginning of the season and you do it right and you're good to go. In the cucumbers, you have what we call Swirsky is another beneficial mite we put out in sachets. We hang these sachets on the plants where they come out for quite a few weeks. And we actually feed them once a week with a little cordless blower. And I think it's cattail pollen they sell you as well. And you actually go and blow this pollen out on your cucumber crop to feed these mites. So you put them out there, you feed them, you keep them established, and then you've kind of built your army against the thrips there. So that's another kind of preventative tool. And then, for example, spider mites, if you get spider mites, you can work against them. Now, the beneficials against spider mites don't live without spider mites. So it's a little bit harder to go preventative. It's a real careful balance between, okay, I've got a few spider mites, get enough of the good guys to take care of it. But if there are no spider mites and you bring in the good guys, well, there's nothing for them to eat if they can't find it. So there's all these balances, but it's pretty intense, and it certainly has its cost. We spend approximately $40,000 to $45,000 per year on the beneficials, and I should add that includes the bumblebees for tomato pollination.
And you're you're probably bringing in those in early. You're not having issues with cucumber beetles and that sort of thing, is that?
Yeah, no, we've never had, no. So really, there are other pests that, we have no issues with. The ones I listed are really the main ones. I could add, we have another bit of a concern issue the last 2 years is pill bugs. They were kind of new to us, or in my growing up years, I don't think I've ever seen one or heard of one. But once we had the greenhouse soil, then I think after a couple of years, what happens is the volume of them just built up so much that last spring we put out cucumbers, and these pill bugs they were like beavers, and they just chewed off, a couple hundred cucumber plants in a couple of days, chewed them right off. So wow. A pill bug isn't necessarily a pest, right? It's involved with the breakdown of organic matter and whatnot, and they're not wrong, but it's just, I think the balance was out of whack. So, that kind of became a challenge. And what we've learned now is we actually plant our cucumbers just in a little PVC ring. And you'd say, well, the bug can crawl over them, but for some reason that's just enough and they're okay. And we've also introduced a few quail. And these little quail, they just hang out underneath the crops. And it seems like they do kind of keep this in check. But that's pretty new to us, so we haven't fully learned everything there. But some of this is just about, something isn't necessarily a pest, but if it's out of balance, it is a pest, right? Or if there's the check isn't there to keep this in balance, then now what's good becomes bad. So,
wow, the quail is an interesting addition. How does that work with your organic certification? Is that an issue?
It's not, I don't think, with that. It is, however, a concern, and that's why sometimes I'm hesitant to talk about it much. But it's we are Canada, like we have on-farm food safety,
Mm-hmm.
and they do have a little no domestic or wild animals present. So what we do say, which myself I'm not concerned about, it is all of our greenhouse crops, like cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, these are all above ground crops, right? So everything that we harvest is hanging up in the air, right? And these quail are on ground birds. So from the practical aspect of it, there's really no concern, right? We're not growing cutting fresh lettuce greens off the ground where these birds are burrowing in, right? So there's really not concerned that way, but it is kind of a gray area. But there's more of that we're growing in the soil, and we don't use chemicals, right? We don't use pesticides and things. So this system, I'm going to call it, of on-farm food safety is very much okay with dotting the I's and crossing the T's on using chemicals and killing bugs and all this. But when you grow in the soil and you foliar spray a nutrition, but you don't use a chemical, the system doesn't understand it. So it's one of those little conundrums, but we just don't dig it, and so far it's been okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really fascinating. I like the idea of, in the field, right? You have we have birds all the time that come in and
Sure.
peck out worms and that sort of thing. It's part of the sort of soil food web, and you need that sort of thing. So in the greenhouse, where you're sort of having to play, Mother Nature, God, you have to figure out how to implement those things. And I think that quail is a really cool addition. It's one that I would trust possibly more than things people, often bring up, things like ducks or chickens or something, but something small that's not likely to clumsy over your crops is.
Sure. And now that you mentioned chickens, I could add that not this past winter, but the winter before, we did work with another producer who had 150 young chickens kind of in the last 6 or 8 weeks before lay, and he brought them out once their crop was out. So you have grape tomatoes that have fallen on the ground right through the year from harvest, and you got little bits of this and bugs, and so we just let them go for a few weeks in the little off season there from mid-December to mid-January. And so, they do a lot of, scratching and pecking and stirring and, dusk bathing and the whole 9 yards, right? So, those types of things too, I like it. I think it's valuable. It's just sometimes the little challenges on how to work that all in, right? And, I have some chickens myself, but not really enough to impact an acre of greenhouse soil in 4 weeks, right? So that's the catch. It's, where do you find a couple hundred birds for a couple of weeks and then you want them gone again? Or, I have sheep, but I don't really want to put sheep in a greenhouse, sometimes either, right? So there's these little things that, the scale or the balances or the timings and things like that. Yeah.
Right. Opportunity for a rent a bird business out there in Alberta.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got another question from a Patreon member. This is Jody Miller, and she's interested in both in your thoughts on the future of greenhouse production in terms of artificial light and heat and scale. And there's a place going up, and you may or may not have heard of it, but it's called App Harvest here. It's in eastern Kentucky, where it's really an economically devastated area, but they're trying to build this kind of giant greenhouse, and that went up a couple years ago. And anyway, those sorts of super intensive, sometimes what would you call them, like hydroponic sort of places. Like, what are your thoughts on that? The artificial lighting and all those.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe split that up a little bit. I would say first, I am not a big fan of hydroponics. Obviously, right? We're growing in a in a highly active soil, and I think that soil is absolute key to make these plants healthy and make them taste like what they're supposed to. That being said, I do know and work with or talk to hydroponic greenhouse producers because they're the guys in the kind of the industry that we're in a sense, right? When it comes to technology and greenhouse growing and a little bit the market, not so much because we're in a specialty market, but so hydroponics is not something I'm interested in. I just don't think it's the way to go to healthy food. However, of course, with today's world and production everywhere, it does seem to be a growing thing. And on one factor, like for example, here in Canada, there are local greenhouses going to more lighting and more winter production. And the flip side is, well, otherwise that product might come out of Mexico or even Spain. So is it worse to grow hydroponic cucumber under lights in southern Alberta? At least it's the local economy, right? So I don't there's some good things, but yeah, I've seen many of these hydroponic greenhouses. They're very large, and they're really just a factory, right? The recipe to grow the plant is just a recipe of chemistry that goes in the water, and the plant is a recipe, and the climate is a recipe, and the people pretty much are just a recipe too, right? They just bring in foreign workers and pound out the product. So it loses to me the farm aspect, right? And so I'm not fond of that. I think we need more small farms, right? We need way more small farms that support local centers, right? Why do we need to ship squash from a country away when we can grow winter squash here, and 50 guys can grow an acre of winter squash and supply the local city, right? So you lose that. Kind of on the aspect of lighting and growing, we have been working for several years with various LED lights, and my initial reaction on that is nothing beats the sun. Yes, we grow in a greenhouse and we can manage many things, but the sun is incredibly powerful and the sunlight is very strong, and it's really, really hard to get anywhere close to that with lighting. So that's kind of an indication there. So kind of on that aspect, I just don't really feel that there's a need for indoor growing, right, without a greenhouse. I mean, at least a greenhouse, you're getting good sunlight. We're in an area with good sunlight, so most of March here we've had a lot of sunlight, and even with fresh snow in the ground, we get extra light. Just the light bounces around. So we're keeping the climate warm, but we're getting good growth on a young crop that doesn't necessarily have fruit load, but we're really establishing ourselves well. And you saw the pictures of 6-foot tomato plants with the first couple sets of fruit, and now we're into beginning of April, so we're getting into better light, longer days, stronger light, and almost ready to, once this fruit starts to ripen, to really pound it out.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. And I'm, kind of one thing I wanted to ask you about, you don't have to get super specific. You can get as specific as you want, but I'm curious about profitability. I mean, we talked about the yield on those crops, but then also you're spending a lot on beneficials and on Sap Analyses and all those things. Can you talk about how that shakes out a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's very hard to sometimes split it up per crop. And we've even said with our business how we have employees and they work in the greenhouse and outside, and we grow the variety of crops outside, and then we're packing outside and inside grown crops together for shipping. So it's very, very hard to actually tease apart, the time involved in every crop and whatnot. Initial thoughts on that question are, I don't think we're necessarily any, better, more profitable than, a dainty small farm. I'm going to say no insult, right? But if you're an acre farm and you can manage it yourself and you do well, you may be in the same position, right? We have 8, 10 full-time employees. There's a lot of payroll. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of cost. There's a lot of everything going in, and we're wholesale. So, the price is it's not bad because we work with our customers, but it's not, it's not the retail price. And, some years have been good. Some years have not been great. If we get good yield, and now the last year the demand has been strong, so then profitability and business model is decent. We're fairly unique in the greenhouse, organic soil grown greenhouse, so we kind of have a bit more of an open market, or maybe you could say less competition, or there's nobody really doing the same thing. So those are good opportunities that I think help make it work. But on the broad scale of things, it's a lot happening, and it's a lot of high cost, and certainly not like it's hugely profitable, right? I mean, I love what I do. I live on the farm with my family. There's various aspects to your lifestyle and everything that come together. But, you know, when it comes to, let's say, making a recommendation, should you be this big? Probably not. We sometimes say if we knew how much, you know, sweat and stress a greenhouse this size would have been before we were building it, we probably wouldn't have built it. Same thing, you know, I still like what I do. These crops, you know, I'm still learning every day. But yeah, for sure. And you know, the greenhouse is a high yielding thing, right? We're talking $750,000 of produce out of a greenhouse per year, but just a lot of cost, right? It's a big operation for sure.
And you know, we didn't really talk about this, but I'd love to hear like how you got to that. Like, how did you kind of, what was your path into agriculture in this style?
Sure. So kind of to bring that back to the beginning, I did grow up on the farm here. My dad bought this farm in 1994, and we've been farming in the family for generations. My dad came from Holland with his parents in 1982, but bought this farm in 1994, built a house, did more conventional farming, had some cows, ran some, you know, conventional land for, you know, your wheat, your silage for feed, that type of thing. And then in 2007, he stopped renting some other land, and he converted the place we're on into certified organic production and started growing some different crops. And in 2008, started growing onions. And at that point, I was away from the farm. I had gone for 2 years of university, quit that, went into construction, had my own business. And then in 2011, the idea of greenhouse produce, the idea / opportunity came up, and my dad talked with me and kind of was like, hey, this is, you know, opportunity for you to come back. So that happened. And in 2012, in April, I came back to the farm. We started building the greenhouse, and January of 2013, we seeded first greenhouse crops. Now, this was all based on organic, which in Canada is grown in the soil. We do have a good rule yet on organic greenhouse production is soil based. We are actually growing in the soil, never mind like in pots or anything, right? We're growing in the soil. Some guys will do it in a pot or trough system with soil they mix and bring in. But in Canada, we do not have organic hydroponics, which I think is good. I think it's one thing we see from down in the States, right? The groups working against each other. And I think what happened there is just your basically your big commercial greenhouses I discussed earlier, right? The factory farms wanting to get into organic and so to speak, you know, money talks, right? And the rules change in their favor, and off we go. And that's, I think, the challenge there. While you get, you know, the great small farms growing in soil doing, you know, the real thing, and kind of suffering from the market and these other guys. Anyways, little off topic there, but
no, it's good. I mean, you're definitely not speaking to any, you know, you're definitely speaking to the choir. Most of us are on that same page.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So anyways, back to that, we started, I'm going to say, so to speak, just, an organic greenhouse, right? And had no experience with veggie growing in terms of tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, like literally nothing. So we hired a crop consultant who did consulting for those greenhouse veggie crops in Alberta. Now, he was not organic based at all, but really knew the ins and the outs on these crops, you know, how to manage them, what supplies, you know, what kind of climates to run, how to prune, all of that stuff, right? And the learning curve was tremendous. And it wasn't until, I think, 2015, maybe the first little bits, but especially in 2017, I attended a couple-day conference with Graham Sate out of Australia with the Nutritech Solutions.
Yeah, really great podcast. His nutritional farming podcast is excellent.
Yeah. So he's kind of a hero of mine, and but that was the first time I went somewhere, and he put in, you know, he tied into soil health, plant health, you know, all kinds of nutrition, tied it in with human health so powerfully, and I was gone for 4 days, and I came home, and it was like my mind was blown. I had just an entirely different perspective, and so that was was a real like corner in a sense in the journey, right? Even though I'd already been doing some Sap analysis, I'd already learned a lot. I kind of at the time knew about, the Gabe Brown, the no-till, like, various things like that in mind. But that was the real, like, okay, wow, this just blew the doors open into what's possible. And yeah, going from there, we've had him out a few times. I think he talks about our greenhouse soil in his worm podcast 1 or 2 ago. And so just that real connection between, plant health, soil health, human health, just everything ties in. And he's very knowledgeable about all the aspects, and they tie together. It's quite a complicated world. And sometimes when you're growing, you can overcomplicate things. The best way to learn is just to do it, right? So sometimes you don't need to learn everything before you start, just start. But on the other hand, there's a lot of value to understanding the basics of it all, but just to really hear from someone like him on that entire picture, where somebody actually stood back and looked at, all of the aspects and, talked for 4 days straight. And it was like, okay, wow, this is incredible. We're going to try, all of it.
Yeah. And he's a wealth of knowledge. I definitely recommend the listener to go find that podcast. I don't know how many are up now, but it's maybe 20 or 25 episodes, maybe less, but it's great show. Also, I'm curious too, just before we're done here, you were talking earlier about getting those Sap analyses back and then, kind of doing the recommendations yourself, like trying to figure out what they need. Like, how do you go about that? I feel like for myself, one of the biggest blind spots for me is trying to figure out how to address nutritional issues. Yeah. And so, like, how did you go about learning that? And like, what sort of resources might you recommend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. When people ask me that more often, where did I learn stuff? I sometimes have to stop and think and say, I don't know. I did not do any, formal education on farming, none. My brief university stint was in engineering, and then I became a carpenter. So practical things not involved directly with farming. Lots of reading, lots of books, lots of YouTube. When it kind of comes to, I'm going to say a little bit more on the chemistry, nutrient, antagonisms, all of that stimulation, that whole aspect. I think attending Graham's courses and kind of getting that down pat was a real good start. I'm not sure did the whole, and that's always the catch, right? You look at something like that and you're looking at a lot of chemistry, but we know that there's biology involved, and we know that there's physics involved, and you've got, for example, the biodynamic world, the planting schedules and the preps and all of that stuff. So I do a little bit of that, and yeah, so you're really almost something of everything. But I don't know if that really answers your question. I'm kind of racking my brains here. I don't know if I have it. Actually, that's one of my things. Several years ago, I was kind of constantly looking for, the solution, right? There was somebody, I was going to find somebody, and that somebody would look at my system and be like, well, you're missing this and this and this, right? And I discovered after a few years that person doesn't exist, and the person you're looking for is yourself, and you've got to actually understand, nobody knows your system better than yourself. And it's very hard to bring in even a good consultant or somebody who's really good. They may come over and ask, good questions or see it, but you're the guy or lady or farmer on site every day, right? And you're the one handling that crop and planting it and seeding it and harvesting it and seeing, the variation from the front of the row to the back of the row, front of the greenhouse, back of the greenhouse, whatever. You are still kind of the kingpin that has to tie this together, right? So that's the one thing I kind of say too is don't kind of look for these golden solutions in somebody else, but yeah, everywhere, bits of information from everything. It's even, don't necessarily, like, I'm sure you're familiar with Gabe Brown.
Yeah.
Or that world. And it's like, people have asked me, well, I don't raise cattle. I don't no-till in the field. I don't, grow grass. I don't any of that. However, just because you don't doesn't mean you can't learn something, or doesn't mean, it makes you think different, right? So I think, be willing to look at other systems and learn, or adapt, or just, be creative that way. And then go from there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great advice, because, nobody's one system, like Gabe's system wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense in Kentucky, where I am.
Sure.
We get a lot more rain than he does. We don't have as much access to acreage as he does. But yeah, there's definitely tidbits in there that are applicable, and are applicable everywhere, because it's photosynthesis that we're talking about, and photosynthesis is not discriminatory. Like it just wants the sun, the water, the microbes, the carbon dioxide, etc. Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I mean, I think that's a perfect answer. Well, Andrew Mans, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Glad to be here. It was a good conversation. There's always something to learn. I think the more conversations you have, the more you learn. Even another note on that, we're entering the 9th season, and boy, things have changed, right? But sometimes you're like, well, I think I've reached the point that, 5 years ago or 4 years ago, at some point we had, certain goals, or you imagined you would at some point be somewhere. And I think, we're there, but now that we're there, I think the goals have just gotten bigger, right? So it's kind of like, the more you get into the world, the more you do, the more you learn, just the bigger it seems. There's just even the more opportunity, right? Like there's like, the excitement, there's nothing holding you back, right? I think that's the great part of farming.
All right. If you enjoyed that episode, make sure to follow Mans Organics on Instagram and all the places. Also, for you Canadians, Andrew has started producing cat tunnels. You can find more about that at growhoops.ca. I will hook it up with links in the show notes. You can support our work, including Growers Live, or the No-Till Flowers podcast, or the Winter Growers podcast that just wrapped up, or the forthcoming collaborative farming podcast, or any of it, by going to notillgrowers.com/support. You can also buy a copy of my forthcoming book there. That helps as well. Make sure you are subscribed to this podcast wherever you are getting it, and leave a review. But this week, all reviews must be Joycean, maybe Orwellian, and a little Mandalorian all at the same time. Best of luck. Huge thanks, as always, to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for their help. Big thanks to Mr. James Mando Orwell himself, Willie Breeding for the theme music. Huge thanks, as always, to Hannah Crabtree for her help behind the scenes. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye. Yeah, we really try to avoid the dogma of it. We've kind of evolved the definition of tillage to be much more about soil health than, because I was just dealing with this today. I have this, we started a new farm, so we just moved. And I'm trying to figure out this one plot that I kind of, I have a bed in that's going to be our cherry tomatoes, and I just cannot get the soil. It's requiring me to open it up a little bit more than I normally would. Because it smells a little anaerobic, and I'm afraid that it's holding water a little bit too much. So, yeah, I mean, that you got to do what's best for photosynthesis, and not just like what's best for your ideologies, right? So
yeah, that's right. And I think my general kind of overview of that is that anytime you whether you pick it or you learn about a system and you get too focused on that system, you lose the big picture. And I think that's an issue with farmers is we have a hard time stepping back far enough to really tie the whole world of what we're doing together, if you know what I'm saying, right? Like to look, I have it in our greenhouse, right? You can look at these greenhouses crop daily really closely, but you forget to sometimes step back and be like, well, this pest might actually come from outside the greenhouse, or it might be in that crop. It might, the picture is bigger than the piece we zoom into. So anytime if you call yourself no-till and you will never ever use a piece of tillage, you might actually miss something. I'm not saying we should till, that, right? But that's that kind of that holistic approach.